there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is a special hangout with a Voice for Men. I am Dean Esme, Managing Editor of Voice for Men, and with me, as frequently is the case, is Paul Elam, publisher of A Voice for Men. Say hi, Paul.
Hi, Paul.
And our guest today, we saw her recently in a hangout and thought, hey, we need to do that too. Janice Fiamengo, Professor Janice Fiamengo of the Department of English at the University of Ottawa. Say hi, Janice. And forgive me, hang on, I got a sound issue.
I thought we had that problem cured in you, Dean.
I thought we did too. I've relapsed. It's because we were having technical troubles before. Say hi, Janice.
Hey, hi there. Not for 2.5 hours this time, though.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
I'm not that interesting.
Nor any fumbling to try and get someone else on the line when we just can't. So we're all here now. And hi to Steve Brule. We saw your hangout with him. So Janice, it's very interesting. You had gotten yourself embroiled in controversy over at the University of Toronto when you went there to speak for the Canadian Association for Equality. When was that again? I'm having trouble remembering when that was.
I think that was either March the 7th or March the 8th. I can't remember exactly, of 2013.
Oh my God, you mean it's been 10 months? It feels like yesterday. It feels like yesterday. And Professor Fiamengo gave a pretty good speech there, which you'll find on Studio Brule's page. And some Q&A afterwards. I think I enjoyed watching the Q&A afterwards even more because you had quite some interesting questions, as I recall. What was that, still, even though it was some time ago, what was that like? First off, how did you get to give that speech in the first place?
Well, I was invited by the Canadian Association for Equality after I had contacted them following, I think, the first event that they had when they invited Warren Farrell to speak about the challenges facing boys and young men, the way in which they're being left behind in our society. And there was such a huge, vicious, vitriolic protest for Warren Farrell, and I contacted Cafe at that time and said that I'd be interested in being an advisor, and I told them that if they wanted to start up a chapter of Cafe in Ottawa, I'd be interested in acting as a mentor, perhaps for young men at university, and so then they invited me down to speak.
And you had protests at that speech, right?
Yeah, there were protests. I actually went in the back door, so I didn't see a lot of the protests until afterwards. And I have to say that people in the room were pretty respectful. A few people, well, a fairly significant number, got up and left at a certain point as a gesture of anger, I guess, or contempt. But and there was a bit of angry questioning. But in general, I thought that I was treated decently during the talk. But there was a lot of fairly vociferous protest outside, and of course someone did pull the fire alarm just as we were about to start. Suppose it could have been an accident, but it seemed pretty clearly an attempt to shut down the talk, and so yeah.
And then you had some Q&A, and some of the questions were from kind of angry folks. The thesis of your speech, what was it again? I know I watched it.
The thesis was essentially that women's studies isn't really an academic discipline at all, because an academic discipline would make some attempt objectively to find truth, and that it would use evidence in a responsible manner, and that it would be interested in a subject from a variety of viewpoints. And my point was just something that seems to me pretty much self-evidently true, that women's studies is not an academic discipline in that sense. It's the academic arm of the radical feminist movement, that it's riven with biases, and that it is about changing the world rather than about finding truth, and it's a real problem.
Well, now that's the more the meat of what I wanted to get into, or what I was hoping we were going to get to talk to about here, because most people, I suspect most people watching this already know about the protests, already saw the speech. I just wanted to mention it for those who didn't recall. I am very interested in your views on radical feminism and how you came to them and how you defend the thesis that it is not really an academic discipline.
Well, it makes it clear. I'll maybe start with the last point first. The departments of women's studies all across the country make it pretty clear that they aren't about the objective pursuit of truth. In fact, as some of the questioners at my talk made clear, they don't believe there is such a thing as the objective pursuit of truth. I have to say, too, that I agree that it's difficult to pursue truth objectively. We all have our baggage, our life experiences, our social context, but I think certainly an attempt can be made to do so, which means considering a variety of viewpoints and attempting as much as possible to follow the evidence where it leads you rather than trying to arrive at a predetermined end. But the discipline of women's studies makes no bones about the fact that it is an activist discipline. If you look at the websites of such programs, they're filled with language indicating their advocacy role. They talk about empowering students. They talk about transforming students' worldviews. They make it pretty clear that what they're interested in is indoctrination rather than education. And of course, if you believe that the world is so out of joint, there are manifest oppressions everywhere, that women are victimized in every sphere of society, well, of course, you wouldn't believe that the objective pursuit of truth is something very valuable. You would think that it's much more important to transform consciousness and to teach people how to engage in revolutionary activity. And that's what I think, not all, but most women's studies professors and feminist professors believe.
Okay, now I'll challenge you a little bit. Do you have a degree in gender studies?
I don't have a degree in gender studies. I have a PhD in English, but I did a comprehensive exam in feminist theory. Those are the exams that one takes before one writes the thesis part of the degree. So I did a comprehensive exam in feminist theory. I read very widely in feminist theory, and I wrote a feminist-oriented PhD thesis. So I feel, although it's true that in the last 5 to 10 years I haven't kept up with the most recent developments in feminist theory, I think I'm pretty familiar with the tenets of most feminist theories.
Well, if you did your entire thesis on it, and I take it you took a pro-feminist view at that time?
Yeah, I was a feminist, certainly. I had read such radical feminists as Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon and Robin Morgan. Robin Morgan, who said, for instance, that man-hating is an honorable and viable political act because the oppressed class has every right to hate the oppressor class. I read all of that. I read Andrea Dworkin's arguments about how there can be no consent to sexual intercourse in a society in which men oppress women, that all sexual intercourse between men and women is rape. And I was, if not entirely convinced personally, I certainly found those theories provocative and persuasive to a certain degree. And it was only later when I saw what feminism looked like in action, when I was hired as a university professor, that I really began to draw back from it.
Have you,
if I
go ahead.
Interject with a question here. I'm really interested in the process for you, because I already knew before Dean questioned you that your dissertation was along the lines of a feminist narrative, and that you were for lack of a better word, ideologically already leaning toward that worldview.
Yeah.
What was the process for you? How did it happen? Was it a sudden epiphany, or was it a slow process that brought you from thinking along the lines of the feminist narrative to taking a view that was now seems to be diametrically opposed to it?
Yeah, I would say that my view now is diametrically opposed. I don't actually believe that we live in a patriarchy. I don't believe that women are oppressed. I don't believe that that men are responsible for all of the evil in the world. That men act on women in violent ways exclusively. That women are always innocent victims of male aggression. I don't believe any of those things, which I think are fundamental tenets of feminist theory. How it happened that I came to reject, I mean, I guess I never embraced those positions 100%, but it is a kind of secular faith. And so there's something very thrilling, intoxicating about that, any kind of revolutionary ideology which has a very clear vision of morally pure victims and morally corrupt victimizers. And I did find it very attractive. It simplifies the world. It adds an element of conviction to one's ordinary day-to-day existence that might otherwise be lacking. So I did find it very attractive. How I came to reject it, I think, was a relatively gradual process, but it was most particularly seeing the way that affirmative action policies worked in practice. And it was so disgusting to me to watch qualified men passed over again and again and again in hiring competitions, and seeing less qualified women, sometimes not even particularly qualified women, hired in their place, and to see the false piety, the denial, the obfuscation of people who were involved in that process, and also to recognize that many of those feminists who were involved in implementing these hiring practices actually didn't care about men at all and didn't care about equality, were really only interested in power. Seeing that was such a turn-off that it led me to question everything else about the feminist worldview.
If I could ask one follow-up to that too, because what you seem to indicate there, which I don't have any difficulty believing, is that there must have been a culture in academic institutions where this was supported and allowed, that it wasn't just isolated incidents, that it was a form of groupthink, and that there was complicity of administration and faculty and most people involved. My curiosity has been about, since as so much of this stuff is overt, and we've seen it for years in the United States too, that similarly the same policies, the same power grabs, and yet so much of it seems to go unopposed. There are so few that, like you, have taken a second look and said, wait a minute, this isn't about equality, it's not about fairness, there's nothing egalitarian about it, it's about grabbing power. Yet even tenured professors remain silent on this, and they seem to, I'm looking for a word that's, I'm looking for a euphemism, but I'm going to go ahead and say spineless, that there's a sort of just a gutless section of our academic institutions that just stands by and watches this and does nothing. Does that sound crazy to you, or are you, was that your experience also?
No, that was absolutely my experience, Paul. There is an orthodoxy in academia that is as powerful as any orthodoxy one could imagine, even though there are no actual physical threats or tangible inducements to conform. There are, well, I shouldn't say there are no tangible inducements, but there are no threats to those who rebel, and yet still most people do conform, simply because I think as human beings we tend to want to conform. C.S. Lewis has a wonderful essay called The Inner Ring, in which he talks about the incredible pleasure that we receive from being liked by people we respect and want to belong with, and that's what I encountered. And there were certainly many people who silently dissented or who grumbled in private about how they didn't believe in, for instance, these equity policies as they were called, but most people just couldn't bear the emotional discomfort of objecting. and certainly there are all sorts of rewards for conformity. You get invited to the conferences, and you get the book contracts, and you have an easier time of it in your tenure and promotion struggles and all of those sorts of things. So there are certain material rewards. But I must say I was surprised when I joined the English department at the first university where I worked. I thought I was going to meet a bunch of individualist, nonconformists, and that we would argue about great literature, and we would argue about ideas, and we would disagree civilly. And what I found was a situation that was very much like high school, in which there were a lot of people desperate to fit in and terrified of offending in any way against the public pieties of the institution.
Thank you.
If I could make an observation or a theory and then ask you to rebut it or agree or whatever, comment. You're talking about that need for conformity, and we all have it, I think. Even nonconformists like me want to hang out with other nonconformists.
Yeah, exactly.
We all do have that. But, I mean, okay, you described the tenure system, and not everybody listening to this will understand what tenure is. Tenure was created more or less a century ago, something like that, in educational institutions to protect seasoned veteran academics from losing their jobs if they had unpopular opinions.
Yeah.
That was the idea behind tenure. What seems to have transpired in subsequent generations is, all right, you want to be a college professor. I assume, for example, being a college professor wasn't something you just fell into. At some point you said, I want to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Yeah, I knew it from a very early age.
Believe it or not, I'd love to do that job, but I already figured out it'll never be for me. But once you're on that, what you try to do is get on what's called the tenure track.
That's right.
Which is you're going to be teaching a certain number of hours, and while it's not supposed to be this way, it also means making friends with and sucking up to the right people, so that you were eventually granted by your peers the tenure status. And it would seem to me that if you're not inclined, if you are in fact a disagreeable personality to the status quo, you're probably not going to get tenure in the first place and will probably walk out in disgust. Does that sound...
Yeah, sure. There's a whole gatekeeping process, as you can imagine, even to get into graduate school, long before you're even looking at the possibility of a job. Your application will be filtered by a group of professors who have a particular ideology and who will not be interested in you if you dissent from that ideology. So even to get into the training institutions that make it possible for you to one day apply for a job as a professor, it requires a certain degree of conformity. And then throughout the whole process of graduate school, you're not only being schooled in your discipline, but you're being schooled in the appropriate attitude to take towards your subject. And then when you apply for a job, you have to prove your bona fides because of your ideology. And then you have those 5 or 6 years in the tenure stream when you're also proving yourself and your orthodoxy. And so, yeah, there's a very long process in which you're assessed. Now, I, at that point, never had a real problem because I didn't object strenuously in those early years to the reigning orthodoxies of academia. It was only afterwards. What is the real question, though, is why even once professors have tenure, they don't speak out. Because at that point, you're really pretty safe. You will be harmed in minor ways if you dissent, but your job cannot be threatened, and yet still you'll find very few who will break the silence.
Well, I didn't. You told me even that when you were young, you attended some feminist protests and enjoyed that righteous rush of. Oh yes. Mm-hmm. Of being part of all that.
Yeah, it's very intoxicating.
So I would guess that in your case, you didn't look dangerous until it was too late.
That's right. Yeah.
That would be,
Yeah,
but
I wouldn't be hired now. I can say that with 100% certainty. I would never be hired now. No one would look at me.
well, you also
Have
had
you
the
experienced any sort of consequences since the Toronto lecture and your sort of the way that you were injected into this public debate about feminism? Has there been any kind of repercussions for you about that?
It's hard to say because I had noticed prior to that, I have noticed a bit of a chill generally. But I'm not absolutely sure that many of my colleagues are even aware of this element of my, public engagement in anti-feminist discourse. I'm not convinced that they are. My colleagues are all extremely discreet and friendly people, and I don't think they would say anything about it, even if they did know anything about it, because it would be embarrassing and awkward and uncomfortable. So, but certainly no, I haven't experienced any negative fallout.
I have one theory that that part of it is you wouldn't be there in the first place if they thought you were going to be a shit stirrer. But
That's
then,
right.
and so that's going to create a certain mentality in academia to begin with.
Yeah.
And then, okay, you're in, you actually have some intellectual rigor to get there. Maybe you're having second thoughts, but you're already a personality type. Paul and I'm not going to name names, but Paul and I have grumbled privately now and then about a few academics we know, and we're like, why aren't they more vocal in what they're doing? And it's like, well, Paul, they're not there because
they're academics.
they wouldn't be there if they weren't like that. Yeah,
yeah.
Well, that's I think a good opportunity. I would like to get Dr. Fiamengo's opinion about, A Voice for Men has developed a reputation for taking shit stirring to a new level. We openly challenge feminist ideologues in ways that many people consider too provocative. And, we'll continue to do what we do the way we do it. But I am curious, since you're an academician that went south on them, on the orthodoxy, what your impression is of people that take the gloves off and say enough is enough.
Well, I think what A Voice for Men does, it does very well, and that is a pretty virile advocacy. And I think it performs a really important service. It's a forum for a lot of men to learn and to speak. Within academia, certainly there tends to be a much more genteel kind of discourse, even when the subjects are really quite revolting, such as a colleague of mine, Elizabeth Sheehy, for instance. I know that you know of her work, claiming that a battered women have the moral and legal right to kill men, even if the men are sleeping, if they can claim that those men have abused them. These are shocking ideas, far beyond the pale of anything that A Voice for Men would advocate, and yet that's seen as perfectly acceptable. So there's a deep level of hypocrisy in terms of what is acceptable and what isn't. But certainly to advocate ideas that are generally considered unacceptable within the academy, one has to be very, very careful how one does it. And I think anyone who took the kind of robust, in-your-face sort of approach that A Voice for Men takes would be very quickly sidelined from all sorts of discussions. One has to be very careful and persuasive and cautious in the way one speaks those kinds of dissenting opinions within the academy. So there is I just wanted to end by saying that I think there's a legitimate difference within the academy. One wants to aim at that kind of objective pursuit of truth rather than advocacy. I think just having knockdown fights in the academy is not all that helpful, so that A Voice for Men can be quite aggressive in putting forward its point of view, quite legitimately so, in a way that I don't think would be appropriate in academic circles.
I guess my follow-up to that would be, as we watch the male studies initiatives struggle not to be sidelined and attacked, and of course they're going to be attacked. It doesn't really matter what their approach is. They're going to be undermined. They're going to be attacked by ideologues. So the question then becomes, even within the normal parameters of what's considered acceptable in the academy, is it even possible for something like a study of gender outside the feminist narrative to even occur right now? Is this certainly not going to happen the way A Voice for Men does business, but it's also it seems to be having a real heck of a time getting anything done within the parameters that are currently established.
Well, so and exactly, it's very difficult, and I think the answer, you've already sort of included the answer in your question. It's very difficult to accomplish very much because the parameters are so narrow, they're so biased. All a critic has to say is that, sorry, my cat wants to get into this. All a critic has to say is that this particular scholar of gender is anti-feminist, and that's enough somehow to discredit that person's scholarship. Well, there's nothing wrong with being anti-feminist. One can have an objection. Feminism is a biased ideology. There's nothing wrong with being anti-feminist. Yet feminism has been so successful in making an equation between the feminist position and every woman's position that to be anti-feminist is seen as being anti-woman and hateful. And so, as you point out, the position for those who are trying to advocate for a different scholarly position, taking issue with the feminist orthodoxy, they're already at such a tremendous disadvantage that I think the gains can only be quite small and incremental. But that doesn't mean that these scholars can't contribute to a very significant turning of the tide, even in this very modest and circumspect way, and I think they may well. I mean, it may be the time for that kind of turning of the tide right now. So I'm actually guardedly hopeful, even though I recognize the enormous barriers that such scholars have to struggle against.
I will I'm sorry, excuse me, I had a problem there. I will make at least one defense for A Voice for Men's content. We have had at least a few articles that I actually think are so well referenced and so well documented they could go into an academic textbook.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, well, thank you. I was going to say, that said, sure, most of our outstriding advocacy wouldn't be appropriate in an academe, but some of it would be.
I agree. I've read some excellent articles on your site.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I have another idea about it because I remember hearing you talking about this elsewhere, and it didn't come out. We're sort of excusing academics by saying, well, they wouldn't be in these tenured positions in the first place if they like to shake things up. But there's another side of this that I think is easily forgotten. You can sit there and say, all right, Janice Fiamengo, you're safe in your job now, right? You get tenure. Doesn't matter if they all hate you. It really doesn't matter. Right, because they're not going to kill you, not very likely. They're not going to follow you home and beat you up, so you're pretty safe. At the same time, if you wanted to, what are your odds of getting a chairmanship right now?
Right,
I've got to wonder.
Yeah, very low. Yeah, My prospects for career, let's not speak about me, but let's just speak generally. The prospects of career advancement for someone who rubs against the grain in this way are very limited. So if you want to advance and you want to flourish and you want to move into positions of great privilege, you have to toe the line.
That's right. If you're looking for grants, if you're looking for funding for additional gender studies projects, if you want an endowment for a department, if you want a department chair or vice chair that you're in charge of, you're still going to have to toe the line, which means the most ambitious people, they're going to be the ones who are most opposed to challenging the orthodoxy, because you actually are still threatening. I mean, they're still going to get their paycheck as a professor, which probably isn't that much. but there's all kinds of other money and all kinds of other power that they have that would go away if their paradigm was challenged, wouldn't it?
Yeah, sure. There are those kinds of difficulties, undoubtedly. So it isn't easy, you know. I still don't think that's an excuse, because the whole idea of being in a university is that you are challenging received ideas. And feminism is certainly one of the major received ideas of our time. So I would expect that there would be more people speaking out. But I think academics are, in general, a timid lot, and they're very worried about loss of prestige, loss of status, and the other kinds of material losses that you've just named that go along with that.
Well, I think one of the things that we can do to help that, and it's a very slow incremental process, as we change the dialogue about sex and power and gender and begin to inject a different worldview into the public consciousness.
That's right.
The accolades and the esteem and the acceptance will change its shape. And there will, I believe, come a time when feminism is viewed as an archaic and outmoded model to look at humanity, and that a new paradigm will be upon us, and hopefully by that point there will be the incentive for academicians to pursue a more honest scholarly examination of sex and power and all the other issues that we look at. But I think we're looking at decades down the road and not anything in the near future.
Yeah, no, I don't imagine it happening overnight, that's for sure. But your point is that universities don't exist in isolation from the wider culture. Unfortunately, the wider culture right now, in terms of all those elite institutions like the mainstream media and the judiciary and the professions of social work, for instance, all of those are heavily feminist. And therefore, it's no surprise that the university is too. And this took a number of decades to come into place. It started, I guess, in the late 1960s and grew in intensity through the 1980s and 90s. So now, if there is going to be any sort of shift, it will take a number of decades as well. But those who are in positions of power are firmly of the orthodoxy, and they're very careful about gatekeeping. So it's going to be a struggle.
I'll tell you, this is just an editorial comment. On A Voice for Men, periodically we pause and celebrate our achievements. While we often recognize that the men's movement has a great deal more to go, we'll pause and celebrate our achievements, and then we'll invariably have somebody come along and say, you haven't accomplished anything. Nothing's really changed. And, my only answer to that is, A, you're wrong, we have accomplished things, but B, we're patient ones. What Professor Fiamengo just said, we expect it to take decades. We're in this for the long haul. We expect it to take decades. I assume you do too, Paul. I mean, at least all of it.
Well, if you look at the fact that Seneca Falls happened in the mid-1800s, it was 70 years after that before the 19th Amendment was passed in the United States, and another 50 years after that before gender feminism reared its ugly head in the late 60s. Social movements of this nature don't happen overnight. They happen over centuries sometimes, and certainly over decades. So, no, I think we've made a lot of progress just in that you can tell that we now have feminist ideologues having to acknowledge, God forbid, that there are men's issues. They have begun to get defensive about how they're articulating issues. They are defending themselves against the allegation that they're ignoring men. That was not something that was happening 5 years ago. And the fact that we changed the dialogue that much is progress. It is not the end game. It's not anywhere near it. But if anybody thought we were going to have a parade sometime in June and we were going to celebrate true equity between the sexes, that is a pipe dream. This is a long, hard struggle that's going to require generations of people to sort out. But we have to, the old saying, every journey starts with one step, and I believe we've started.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Wasn't it Churchill who said it wasn't the beginning of the end, but it was perhaps the end of the beginning? And
Exactly.
so
there you
maybe
go.
that's where we can say we are. We're at the end of the beginning of the resistance. And so there is still a long way to go. But I agree with you that at least now there is a pushback. There are voices both within the academy and outside who are rigorously challenging feminist tenets. And feminists themselves are aware of that pushback. They're also aware of the fact, I think they can't help but be, and surely some of these people are, worried about their sons, and they must recognize that there is also a more and more publicly visible crisis right in the university. Of course, the number of men dropping out of university and not doing well and clearly suffering harms as a result of the reflex hostility that is everywhere present in academia. That too, I think, is going to play a role in feminist defensiveness and backtracking on some of their, mainstream claims.
And that's something else I'd like to ask you about, and this will be more, is the word I'm looking for, prosaic? I don't know. What have you seen in the classroom as far as young men going from, let's say, when you started teaching to what you see today?
Yeah, well, that's the thing that was the other thing that really made me eager to participate in the cafe event in Toronto last year. Just the sense that men are giving up on a lot of disciplines, certainly just by numbers. There is no argument to be made. Men are now 40% or less at universities all across North America, and that always shocks me. If it were happening that young women were dropping out of university in the way that young men are, it would be front page news, and everyone would be discussing it, and there would be scholarships to encourage women, and there still are, of course. There would be initiatives, there would be public fora, meetings about what we can do to encourage young women to boost their self-esteem, all of these things. This is happening for young men, and very little is said about it, although there's starting to be some recognition. And that's my sense, in the humanities, certainly, which is the area of scholarship that I know. A lot of young men are apologetic about their presence. They're apologetic about speaking. They have clearly imbibed the lesson that they are the inheritors of, centuries of privilege, although I'm sure they don't feel privileged at all, that they should take a back seat to their sisters, that if they care about justice, they should silence themselves and listen to the voices of young women, that they're responsible for all the evil in the world, that all good things come from women, all bad things come from men. If there were fewer men, there wouldn't be wars, and all those kinds of things. And I see that and the impact it has on young men's psyches, and I just think it's a crying shame, and it manifests itself in discomfort and silence and a kind of general dropping out, both of university and of society in general. And of course that hurts everybody when young men drop out of society in that way. So that's the big challenge that we face now. That is the crisis.
Well, I'm glad we have at least one in there somewhere. I don't know how many more of you there are, Dr. Fiamengo, but I hope we see more come to the surface.
Me too. Definitely. It just seems self-evidently an issue that really needs to be addressed. And I am shocked that there aren't more women speaking out, because I realize that it's easier for me. I can say a whole bunch of things about the state of the university or the state of our culture, and I don't have to worry about being accused of some sort of misogyny or whatever. And I would like to say that I do not dislike women, and I think actually a lot of women really like men and want the best for them. It isn't really a matter of individual women's bias against men. It has to do now with the way a particular ideology held by only a minority of women has taken over the major institutions of our society. So I do hope that more women who have a sensible view and a desire to see men flourish in our society will come forward and speak.
Well, I agree. It's mainly, in my experience, has been feminist ideologues that have made this a men versus women type of problem. I don't see it that way. We get occasionally a few in our community that start with that sort of rhetoric, but they lose popularity very quick because we are talking about an ideology, and particularly with the subject of young men in college. What's so alarming for me is that if we don't recognize the long-term implications of young men falling out of school, the effect that it's going to have on our society at large is tremendous. This is not an inconsequential problem. It's a very, very serious problem, and we're right now still we're not paying attention to it to the level that it needs.
Yeah, I agree, but I do hope that there is a turning of the tide now, and I suspect there is. So I hope we'll see a real change in the next decade.
Well, I think the more, I say this because I say it all the time as a truism, the more of us who come out of the closet, the more of us who can come out of the closet.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you think that's a reference to the gay rights movement, yes, it is. Yes, the more of us who come out of the closet, the more of us who can come out of the closet. So I suspect that's going to happen because I see it happening all the time. At one person at a time, but it happens. I had one other thing I wanted to ask you, and I've forgotten.
Well, you know what they say, it must have been a lie, Dean.
It must have been. It must have been. Okay, well, oh, I remember Dan Perrins mentioned something that he got to know you because he had seen some false domestic violence statistics coming out of the University of Ottawa. Yeah, something from the Ottawa Coalition to End Violence Against Women. Didn't you tell me you had had an experience where you spoke to your colleagues over there and got a rather snippy response?
Yeah, well, not exactly snippy, but just a response. I wasn't sure whether to credit it or not. And the issue was that Dan had discovered that there were statistics up on the Ottawa Coalition to End Violence Against Women's website, and they were taken from the Government of Canada database about domestic violence, except that they were completely wrong in that the person who had counted the, who had looked at the province-by-province breakdown of domestic violence statistics had not recognized that those statistics were broken into women victims of domestic violence and men victims of domestic violence. And the thing that's so staggering about those statistics, of course, is that they're so close. So close. They're nearly exactly the same number. Yeah, virtually identical. Anyway, this person who had looked at those statistics had not realized that they were broken down into male and female victims and had just lumped them all together. And so you had this tremendous number of women victims of domestic violence posted on the Ottawa Coalition's website. And it was up there for a year and a half or something like that. And I wrote to the person who was in charge of the report that had been put up on the website and asked her why there was this error when it had already been pointed out to her. And she wrote back and said that they were doing everything they could, and you know that you know, they were.
Of course they were.
Yeah, you know, but it had stayed up there for months and months and months. And she's claimed that it was difficult to remove, and you know, all of this sort of thing, and it was just an innocent mistake and that. And of course, one doesn't know what's in anyone's heart, and so you are hesitant to make any kind of allegation. But it was really shocking to see how to the extent to which the statistics had been misused, and the lack of speed in rectifying a really egregious misrepresentation of the state of you know, violence against women. So yeah, that was a very interesting case.
As so many reports, just in case anybody didn't quite get it, Dan Perrins was the one who originally brought this up, so mad props to Danny Boy. The stats show virtually equal perpetration, very close to equal perpetration of domestic violence by women, or a virtually equal number of male victims. And the university, that department, that gender studies department, I believe, had lumped all the male and the female victims together and called them all women to inflate the number of female victims. And Dan tells me, although he hasn't given me details, that they did eventually fix it after the problem was pointed out to them repeatedly. He says they've still got some bad information up there, so expect to hear more from him soon on that.
Well, I'll tell you what, he did a much better job, and Dr. Fiamengo too did a much better job than what we've been able to do here in the States, where our Department of Justice website asserts that the #1 cause of death for African American women between 15 and 44 years old is intimate partner violence. And
it's a lie.
Even according to the Department of Justice own research, it's not even in the top 15 lists and causes. And the danger of this, of course, is that if we're telling African American women that the #1 cause of death for them is something that it's not, we're leading them to not pay attention to things that are actually killing them. This is how concerned I am about misinformation, and especially when it gets onto government websites. And that stuff is still up there. It's been challenged by Christina Hoff Sommers. She wrote a great article about it 3 years ago in USA Today, and it sits up there to this day, unchanged.
Yeah, it's really shocking when you see ideology trumping truth in such very important public arenas.
And my friend Aaron would not forgive me if I did not point out to something I've mentioned before. These false statistics were coming from the Ottawa Coalition to End Violence Against Women. There's money there.
Yes, there's a lot of money there. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you ask why some of these academicians are reluctant to speak out, flat out, they have a monetary investment. Some of them in not speaking out.
Yeah. Unfortunately true.
The numbers. It is unfortunately true, and it's shameful. It's very depressing. I've always believed in the value of a liberal education, which is exactly what you were talking about earlier. That we're going to go in and we're going to challenge each other, and we're all going to have different ideas, and we're going to have spirited arguments, not angry arguments per se, but spirited arguments, and really test ideas in the old Socratic method. Oh gosh, I just mentioned an old dead man, Socrates.
He was probably white too, didn't
he? He would have been Greek, so I don't know if you can say that.
Close enough.
Yeah, it's very sad. I mean, that the loss of that ideal. If I had children, I would really, I would hesitate to have them go into any kind of humanities program, because what they receive now is simplistic and dangerously misleading indoctrination in so many courses, rather than an opportunity actually to learn and to become a person who can genuinely, think critically and know things. That simple and yet infinitely precious ideal has been destroyed, and it's very difficult to rebuild it. Once it's gone, and it will take generations.
I'll tell you, and that was the last thing I wanted to get into, which is people who don't get into this go feminist ideology. What's that got to do with an English class anyway? I have my answer. I'll ask you if you want to expand on it. But here's one of the things. This is something our friend Karen Strawn has observed. It has reached the point, not just in academia, but in everyday society, where feminist assertions are merely accepted as factual and uncontroversial.
Yeah.
And that's actually ideology in place. So, for example, I've met people, younger people, especially if I say, women, the idea that women historically were oppressed by men is really extremely questionable and actually kind of hateful, and they're just shocked. Like you would ever suggest that it was not true that women were oppressed by men.
Yeah.
But that's a challengeable idea, isn't it? I think it's more than a challengeable idea. I knew my great-grandmothers. Those were not oppressed women.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly there were areas in which women experienced social disadvantage. The attempt to achieve the vote. Again, my cat's trying to get in on this. The attempt to achieve the vote.
Your cat's a feminist. Your cat's a feminist.
Yeah, he's got some very strong ideas. You know, certainly there were issues around women's right to own property. Women were barred from certain professions. All those kinds of things. This is one of the areas that I worked on in my English studies thesis. I looked at certain feminist writers of the late 19th, early 20th century. They were concerned about some legitimate disabilities, whether that meant that all men oppressed all women, you know, that all men were privileged. Of course, that's absolutely not true. The tiny percentage of men who were privileged, you know, is never really acknowledged in this very simplistic version of male aggression and privilege. It's not the case. Most men's lives were as constrained and difficult and lacking in liberty and power as most women's lives. And you're right that the feminist narrative has been so successful in shaping not only how we understand where we are now and what our society is like, but especially where we have come from. And so that is an area where some really solid anti-feminist academic work needs to be done to redress the historical narratives by which we understand our culture. I think it's a really good point.
Yeah, and I know we're running short of time here, so I'm going to make my last hurrah, is that I always feel obligated to point this out anytime the issue of suffrage comes up.
Yeah.
In looking historically. In the United States right now, men's right to vote is still something that is tied to their registering for selective service and volunteering their bodies for use by the government, often to represent corporate interests, in wars across the world.
That's a fascinating point, very important, yeah.
If we don't register for the draft, for selective service, we don't have the right to vote. That is a burden that has never been placed on women in this culture. So even in examining the idea of suffrage, we have to, I think, include other rather relevant facts about the realities of men's lives that don't just paint this picture of poor voteless women and powerful men who got to run the world. When it was never that
absolutely,
way.
There were women back then, even including Mother Jones and quite a few others, who just thought the whole idea women needed to vote was nonsense. Mother Jones was famous for saying, "What do you need to vote for? You don't need that to raise hell and change things." Which is not to say women shouldn't have the vote. I'm just saying it was always a complex question.
Yeah. Well, all of these questions are complex, and that's the thing that is completely elided when you take this sort of feminist biased approach, that the complexities of experience and the complexities of the situations that we find ourselves in now are consistently misrepresented in ways that are really damaging.
Simple-minded, simplistic, not looking at where women were privileged and men were oppressed.
Right.
You leave all that out and you've just got this dumbed-down history that is kind of insulting to our ancestors, but...
It sure is.
I have another word for it. We call it fascism.
Yeah.
And it is.
Yeah.
In terms of intellectual fascism, just holding down, this is the idea, you hold this idea and you pass, you don't hold this idea and you fail.
Yeah.
I can see that.
Yeah, and that is certainly the case too, that if you are a student in one of these classrooms who tries to assert a dissenting point of view, maybe an intellectually curious student who's done some of his own reading, unfortunately professors are often quite adamant about disallowing those dissenting views in the classroom, in essays, in whatever way, and that's really a shame as well.
I've seen it myself. Okay, well, we've been going about an hour now, and I promised Professor Fiamengo we would not go too much longer. Is there anything else you guys would like to talk about or close with?
I'd be happy to yield the last word to Dr. Fiamengo. I've had my say.
Oh, well, I've had more than my share, I think, too. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, and keep up the great work.
Same
Well,
to
thank
you.
you, Professor Fiamengo. We may even hit you up for an article one of these days. All right.
I've been working on that for a year.
I promised one ages ago. I know. It's still in my head.
Oh, really? All right. Now I'm
promise,
actually.
yeah.
And now we have that on public record.
That's right. All right. Thank you so much, Dr.
Okay.
Fiamengo. Let's hope
Thank
your
you.
fellows in academia see you and take courage and inspiration from you.
Oh, thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.